Hello, Frank.
Good afternoon, Professor.
The world seems to get more and more interesting every week, but we certainly didn't expect the news that came through, what was it, 3 days ago now, I think, to begin with, and all the follow-up and commotion that has continued since then. The question is whether that really has anything to do with globalization or not. And that's the difficult question, because I think most people don't see it in those terms at all.
I think from an American perspective, it's refreshing. I hate to use that word, but to be able to see what seems to be an Iranian-sponsored threat, a Shia threat, quite legitimate apparently, and if you believe the chairperson of the House of Representatives Intelligence Committee, this is only one of many Iranian plots that he's been briefed on. God knows what he's talking about. To, of course, kill the Sunni Saudi Arabian ambassador to the U.S. and I guess for good measure blow up the Israeli embassy in Washington. It sort of brings into very stark relief this whole Sunni-Shia conflict, and it's sort of unnerving. We've been discussing globalization for a number of sessions, and we're talking about its effect on cross-cultural pollination. We're talking about its effects on breaking down former boundaries of nationalism, and yet here in very stark relief again is this ancient conflict. It's like, my God, I mean, these people still aren't over this. I mean, they're determined to eradicate each other. It's sort of mind-blowing.
But we have to remember that the Iranians are accused of helping the Taliban, who are not Shia. They're accused of supporting Hamas, which is not Shia, and Hezbollah, which is not exactly a straightforward Shia organization. Although it is Shia, I suppose. But anyway, there's a lot of mixing of these things, and the Iranians are obviously intent on showing that anything America can do, they can do. Mm-hmm. And the media don't tell us what America is doing covertly in Iran. We only hear what Iran may be doing covertly in America and other countries. So the media really make it very difficult for us to understand everything. And of course the media are only reporting what comes to their attention. Mm-hmm. And so much is not actually published in the media, and only the information becomes available only to people who specialize in the area and are looking for these things. But what's interesting, what's obviously interesting about it from the point of view of globalization is that there are a lot of different sorts of people from different countries involved. And so that's one thing. There's international players. We're told that there's a lot of evidence that it was organized from Iran. However, nobody explains really what Iran's intentions could have been for doing something that would bring together the two international powers that it is most at loggerheads with, who Saudi Arabia and America, which have been drifting apart, and this brings them back together again.
That's a very good observation.
So there's a lot about this that is mystifying, and actually the comments I read from a variety of specialists give the impression that there's a lot of skepticism about whether it can be true, at least in the terms that we're being told. And then the supreme leader in Iran gave a speech in a city in western Iran earlier this week, in which he concentrated on the Occupy Wall Street demonstrations in America. Mm-hmm. as a month ago he'd focused on the riots in London and all this, so that there is obviously a way of looking at all these things which is not rooted in any particular, or need not be rooted in any particular country, and sees different types of commotion going on in different parts of the world, and some people are drawing connections among them all, and some people aren't.
Well, I guess one of the things that concerns me is we talk about globalization and the processes that it unleashes, frequently rippling through geographic areas, across boundaries. We talked about the Arab Spring, we talked about the protests in Wall Street, we talked about the riots in London, and yet here we have possibly, and I'm glad you caveated it. I mean, this does sound like a little bit of a half-cocked scheme. I mean, hiring drug cartel people to engage in acts of sabotage in the U.S., and apparently this is a very militant special operations wing of the Revolutionary Guard that bypasses the civilian authority and reports directly to the supreme religious leader. It is very murky, I grant you. But nevertheless, I mean, you have these posh residences in North Tehran where very westernized enclaves of Iranians live and enjoy the BBC and have satellite dishes, and I understand even drink alcohol, and you see some of the things on Twitter from young people. They're every bit as westernized within the walls of their apartments and condominiums as an American teenager might be, but yet where's the disconnect? I mean, you have these enforcers, the religious enforcers down on the street in the public squares, and then up on the 30th floor you have these relatively westernized groups of people. It just seems to be, I don't understand.
Yeah, I would argue that this isn't necessarily an example of Western influence in Tehran, but that people have been drinking in Iran as long or longer than they've been drinking in America, and Iran only turned to prohibition very recently, although I suppose you could argue that officially there's been prohibition ever since Islam, but alcohol has always been available to the shall we say, the landed classes, and now the people in the middle class and upper echelons of society in Tehran, although it obviously there are bigger penalties, worse penalties for being caught drinking now than there ever were before. And all the other things that you can point to in entertainment places in Tehran today, private and public, that look like westernization. In fact, I would argue that they're not. If you're seeing them as westernization, it may be misunderstanding them to a certain extent, because what's happening is that the young there are aware of what's going on among the young elsewhere, and they may get it directly from America, but there's all sorts of other places they can get it from as well. So it's more a question of awareness of what's going on in other parts of the world in general than just America in particular.
Well, let me, if I could, just to pick on that thread a tiny bit. Ahmadinejad is apparently being marginalized from all press reports by the religious leadership. He is nothing if not pragmatic. I mean, he's a little bit out there, if you will, on his political ideas, but I think in comparison to the stridency articulated by the religious leadership, he's actually could be viewed as fairly pragmatic. And yet I'm wondering, what would a young person who's learning about what other young people worldwide are learning about, what would that young person think about a plot, if in fact it's true, that was fomented and planned by the religious leadership, that is going to do, as you said, bring together Iran's two greatest enemies and increase the economic sanctions on the country and continue to put them much further in a hole economically?
Well, I think that if it was in fact planned in Iran, it would have been planned in the security forces in the people in Iran, the various security organizations who are not clerics, or at least not run by clerics, and then approved by the supreme leader, so that the clerical establishment in general can't be considered to be responsible for it, any more than the general intelligentsia can be considered to be responsible for it. Mm-hmm. And it's ration. I mean, this is on the assumption that perhaps it is being described to us correctly, which I must say I doubt. The point is that these people are responding to what they see America doing in their country. But still, it's difficult to believe that they're doing it, because it brings Saudi Arabia and the US together, whereas it's in Iran's interest to do exactly the opposite of that. Mm-hmm. And there was some suggestion also that our security people who found out the details of this and have been following it for some time know of similar plots by Iran to assassinate other ambassadors here. And I'm not sure whether everyone was in this country or somewhere in other countries, but including an Israeli ambassador. So I suspect more of this will come out. And then, of course, there's the problem that one of the people involved is an American citizen, and if he is tried, then it will have to be presumably a public trial, and a lot of evidence will have to come out. Although I imagine there may be ways around that, I don't know. Anyway, the bigger question seems to me to be how one can make sense of all this in terms of the way the world is changing. And I would say that everything that happens from week to week that we've been following, most of the things that we've been following, have something to do with the breakdown of international order. Order is becoming less. All the sorts of things that we used to think we could depend upon in international order are becoming less and less dependable. We keep on being shocked, surprised by things that are happening like this. And I think that that probably is a mark of the way the world is changing, because I would suggest that as we move towards being away from being a world community of nations with populations ranging from a few thousand in some places, some members of the United Nations, up to 1.3 billion in the case of a couple, up from there up to a point where we're one community with 10 billion, then the whole problem of how order is maintained becomes more and more difficult to manage. And there are two sides to this, and we tend to only focus on the side of how we're going to develop a world government or a global legal system or something like that. But we forget that at the same time, all the ways that we have been establishing law and order in everyday society are ceasing to work. And there are so many more loopholes for people who want to take advantage of situations.
Well, the flip side of that order argument, of course, is power. And whether or not it's power from a government or a legal authority or a legal system, or power from a religion, something that maintains and imposes a structure. Perhaps those are the institutions that are eroding now because of the increasing globalization, which is why, again, this is unfortunately we can't accurately guess the veracity of the events of the attempted assassination plot, but whether or not it in fact was a Shia versus Sunni kind of thing, I guess that's what brings this sharp contrast up now, that this erosion doesn't seem to have penetrated that yet. And one of the things that you and I discussed in the exchange of emails is that you observed that the West, the religion is no longer the guise in the West, referring to political power. but perhaps that has not yet occurred elsewhere in the world.
Well, the thing is that the relationship between religion and political power has a very different history outside the Western world, outside Christendom, from what it has inside Christendom. And Christians have fought Christians from the beginnings of Christianity up to the present.
Yes, they have.
And Muslims have fought Muslims, but the ideas about what constitutes legitimate authority in Christianity throughout the period have been very different from the ideas about what constitutes authority in the Muslim world. Authority in the Muslim world is in the hands of scholars who work in the form of a college, which is essentially where we got the idea of a college from, whereas authority in Christendom has been coming down directly from the original authority. Actually, one could argue, and in fact Khamenei would argue, that the Shia idea of authority is exactly that as well, but not in the Muslim world in general. But nobody knows how we're going to establish an idea of legitimate authority in the globalizing world that we're moving towards, and that, I think, is the basis of the problem. And I see our time is up.
Oh, it is already? Oh, all right. Well, okay, thank you. I'll look forward to the next. All right.